The topic of this lesson is going to be on coding to abstractions. So the best way for me to illustrate this is just to dive in immediately. Within the source directory, I'm going to add a new Stripe billing.php. This will be a class that's responsible for billing using the Stripe API. So let's go ahead and create this Stripe class, and maybe it'll have a method called charge, and we're going to simulate charging. So we're going to return charging with Stripe. So this is fine, and I'll go ahead and add the namespace while we're at it. Namespace Acme, maybe billing. That looks good. But now imagine that we have a controller. So we will simulate a controller by doing source/purchases controller. That looks good. All right, let's go ahead and create this class. That looks good. And then once again, namespace, we'll just say Acme. We could put that within controllers. It doesn't really matter. This is mostly pseudocode here. So now basically what we want to do is for the purchases controller, presumably we're responding to some kind of URI. So when a certain URI is requested, we're going to trigger this method on our controller, and that controller then needs to call the necessary class that will perform the charge. So maybe we'll have something like, I don't know, we're not working resourcefully here, maybe just something like buy. So when this method is triggered, what we then want to have happen is say Stripe equals new Stripe billing, and then Stripe charge, and then you would pass through the charge info that we don't really have here. Charge info, and we'll set that to an empty array. And then this method will receive that. That would contain the necessary token, the information about the product that they want to purchase, and then we will charge them with Stripe. So all of this looks fine. So we could say result, var dump the result, and the only remaining thing to do is fix this typo and use the file. Use acme/billing/Stripe billing. All right, that looks good. So when the buy method on the purchases controller is triggered, it's going to create a new instance of this class right here. It's going to call the charge method here, and it's going to var dump the result. So it should just var dump charging with Stripe. Let's go ahead and try this out. New purchases controller, buy. And now we will run this within the console. PHP source/purchases controller. And of course, that's because we're doing this in a very casual way, so we're not including the autoloader. Require vendor/autoload.php and try it again. There we go. And now we get charging with Stripe. So of course, you don't want this in your controller. We're just doing this to make it easier for me to teach. So all of this seems fine, but again, how would you go about testing that? Well, there are some tools that we're going to go over that would allow for this. Specifically, I'm referring to a tool called Aspect Mock that allows us to capture this instantiation and replace it with a mocked version. But just for traditional PHP unit testing, this isn't really testable in isolation. So when we try to call this buy method, there's basically no way with basic PHP unit to intercept that instantiation and replace it with a mock. So now we have no way to test in isolation. Let's go ahead and try that out though to verify it. I'm going to edit test/purchases controller test.php, and we'll say purchases controller test extends PHP unit framework test case, and our first method will be test bills a user. And now I'm basically going to get rid of the autoloader here, but I can copy that and paste it in. So now when we create a new instance of purchases controller, and we'll use that, Acme purchases controller, when we create a new instance of that and we call the buy method, what do we expect the result to be? Well, let's just find out right now. Var dump result, and if I run PHP unit, we do get charging with Stripe. But this is basically an integration test at this point. It's not an isolated unit test. And by that I mean there's no way, like I've said a couple times now, there's no way to intercept this. So what are we supposed to do if we want to replace this with a mocked version? Well, what do you think? The answer is to use what we call dependency injection, which is the main subject of this lesson. So dependency injection is a confusing bit of jargon to refer to a very simple thing. Stripe billing is a dependency of the purchases controller class. So the term dependency injection just means instead of instantiating these dependencies directly within the class, we're going to inject them, dependency injection. So we can do this within the constructor. So we could say we want an instance of Stripe billing, and we're going to call this Stripe. And by the way, I want you to be paying attention that we are locking our controller to our billing provider. I'm doing this on purpose. We're going to clean this up later, but I want you to pay attention to that. Now this controller, the web layer, is linked to your billing provider, which is Stripe. What about in the future if you decide that you want to use something like Braintree instead? Well, you're going to have to update all of this code. We're going to talk about that in the following lesson. Let's first finish up this dependency injection example. So now I'm going to run a little macro to set the property on the class, like so. And now when we call this by, rather than instantiating it here, we could simply say this Stripe charge. However, now if I run it, notice that the first argument passed to the constructor should be an instance of Stripe billing, but we haven't done that. Well, let's go back to our test class and do that now. We will say controller equals new purchases controller, and we're also going to pass it a new instance of Stripe billing, billing/Stripe billing. Now I can say controller by, and once again, store that within the result variable. The only remaining thing to do is let's use new Acme billing Stripe billing, or let's just get rid of that entirely and then duplicate this and say Acme billing Stripe billing, like that. That's a little cleaner. Now if I run PHP unit again, we're still going to get charging with Stripe, but the important thing is now we've decoupled our code and simply requested this dependency rather than going through the process of instantiating it directly within the class. Here's where the good part is though. Now we can replace Stripe billing with a mock, and we can do that with the mockery tool that we've already reviewed. Here we'll say our mock will be mockery mock, and we need to give it the full class name, Acme billing Stripe billing. And now we'll perform our expectation. Mock should receive, and let's take a look, it should receive this method called charge. Should receive charge once and return you've been X'd. Now that we've created a mock version of Stripe billing, we can simply, rather than passing in the Stripe billing class itself, we can replace it with the mock that we just prepared. And now we're going to do the same thing, call the by method. That will then in turn call the charge method on the class that we've mocked, and we've already dumped the result. Let's see it. PHP unit, and we get you've been X'd. So notice how easy that was. Because we leveraged dependency injection, we accomplished two things. We decoupled our code, which is always better. It allows you to use this code in other projects and places. And also, because we are injecting the class, we now have the ability to mock a class, inject that into another class that we're trying to test as a dependency, and then perform an expectation on that mocked class. So that's all dependency injection really is. It makes it easier to test, and it decouples our code. Remember, the single responsibility principle is very important here. Is it the controller's job to bill a person? Well, no, it's not. It should be a dedicated class's job. And then at the same time, should the controller be responsible for instantiating this other class, doing any kind of extra setup? No, that's not really its job either. It simply should say, hey, in order for me to do my job, I need an instance of this Stripe billing class. And that's what we've done here. We've injected our dependencies. So in the next lesson, I talked about coding to abstraction. We're going to talk about why this isn't ideal. Stay tuned.